Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now begin our evening. It is my pleasure to introduce a person who has made such a significant contribution to the city of Stratford. A person who has cared for the arts in all their forms for many, many years, who has attended the festival and loved the plays that she's seen here over time, and has been a member of our Board of Governors, begun a wonderful restaurant called the Old Prune, established a chef school, which has made a difference to this country in terms of the graduates that have come out that have worked all over the world and across Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor Kane.
Thank you, Anthony. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be in the company of lovers of Shakespeare, lovers of the Stratford Festival, and lovers of food. It's a true pleasure to be able to introduce Adam Gopnik to you. I should just announce something that's, I believe, happened today, and that is that Adam Gopnik received an honorary doctorate from McGill University. So congratulations. Having recently attended the Shakespeare Slam in Toronto, featuring New Yorker writer and essayist Adam Gopnik and singer-songwriter actor Torquil Campbell, such a fun, vigorous, intellectual riposte, I thought, how could anyone do justice in an introduction of Mr. Gopnik? Best to turn to the sources. For anyone serious about gastronomy, coming across Gopnik's 2011 book, The Taste Comes First, which deals in part with two late 18th century working philosophers of taste, Grimaud de la Reynière and Brillat-Savarin, is for me truly heartwarming. As Gopnik says, almost all food writing since has taken as its mask either Brillat's warm, ironic smile or Grimaud's brilliant epigrammatic grimace. Food writing was born in the wake of the Revolution. If only symbolic, the end of the French Revolution marked the reinvention of the restaurant as an institution of choice. Choice of venue, choice of menu. Gotham's evocative taste on restaurants is compelling. Places of hope, he writes. Restaurants and cafes are also places of reassuring mystery. Their mystery reassures because, in reminding us of lives and appetites beyond our own, they remind us of worlds we have yet to enter. How could we not be transported by such ideas? Gopnik continues, taste begins at the door and ends in our dreams. Taste is choice. Taste is work. Taste is everywhere and results from everything. Taste is the totality of our lives. No surprise, really. For any lover of the city of Paris, Gopnik's earlier book, Paris to the Moon, is a must-read, a chronicle of the 5 years which Gopnik, his wife Martha, and son Luke spent living in Paris from 1995 to 2000. Gopnik chooses the trivial, the mundane, but the very human details about making a home and raising a child in a foreign country. They lived in the 7th arrondissement, not far from the gushing markets of Rue Claire. Permit me an aside, Paris to the Moon was featured this winter as part of the Stratford Chef School's Gastro Book Club. As both participant and observer, Gopnik expresses the contrast of French and American cultures in a most unique way. using food as a metaphor and always with wry humor. Often his observations are through the lens of his then 4-year-old son, Luke. One of the most beautiful for me is that of Luke's gradual mastery of the carousel challenge during their frequent walks through the Luxembourg Gardens. Gopnik marvels at his son's intense focus on catching the rings with a little stick as the carousel picks up speed. He writes, "It's a tough game, and what makes it odder is that there is no reward for doing it, for doing well at it. You don't even get to keep the ring for a moment of triumph." Gopnik compares, in a later part of this book, retirement in France, where the idea isn't scary, versus that in America, where to stop working is, in a sense, to stop living. France does not have the Florida-style gulags like America, where old people are dressed up like 6-year-olds in shorts and T-shirts and sneakers. For the French, life becomes more interesting when they stop working. But for now, we can hold our breath as Adam dissects the feasts of William Shakespeare's time. Please join me in welcoming this very gifted thinker and writer.
Eleanor, thank you for that beautiful and generous introduction. I should say that when Anthony first asked me to come here and talk to you about Shakespeare's feasts, I think that he had in mind something that would be kind of fun. Sort of little descriptions of good times and Elizabethan roistering and high moments amongst like-minded people. But then I got this honorary degree yesterday. It was totally undeserved and unearned, so I decided I would earn it here tonight by presenting you with a horribly well-researched thesis on Elizabethan feasting and its manners. And the truth is that though we start out thinking about Shakespeare and food and feasting and expecting we'll have a kind of celebration of the joy and the fun of dining. Shakespeare's a wonderfully celebratory writer. The truth is so often with Shakespeare, the moment we actually begin to look at the text, we begin to look at the plays, what we find isn't just a pattern of affirmation, but a much more complicated program of ambivalence and ambiguity and uncertainty about where the joys of eating reside and what they really ought to mean. In my book, The Table Comes First, which Eleanor was kind enough to talk about, I do indeed talk about how one of the strangest, most interesting things about this odd, universal human business of eating is that we are amazingly good as people, as human beings, in turning our mouth tastes into moral tastes. We do it kind of instantaneously. There's not a group of people anywhere on the planet who don't have a set of rituals about eating. Strange if you think about it. There are two things we're obliged to do, breathe and eat. For the most part, as you go around the world, you don't find people saying, well, we only breathe through our mouths from Tuesday to Thursday, then we breathe through our noses on Saturdays and Sundays, and on alternate Mondays, we try and breathe through our ears and fail. Doesn't happen that much. But there isn't a tribe or a group or a nation who don't have very complicated, ritualized ways of turning the mouth tastes of our food into the moral tastes of our lives. And God knows Shakespeare is obsessed with that. He's constantly playing with the way that our mouth tastes become moral tastes, and far from being a kind of naive celebrant of the pleasures of the table, he's a constant complicator about the meanings of food. Think even, if you would, of the most familiar kind of aphorisms, the things you find in wedding toast book when you're looking for something good to say after a wedding and you're trying to borrow something from Shakespeare. Kind of famous lines. If music be the food of love, play on. How many wedding toasts have started lamely with that line? Or tonight, Jeffrey and Marcia, the world is your oyster. Even worse weddings have gone on with that one. Shakespeare, right? Shakespeare and food, Shakespeare and the pleasure of food. But if you actually go back and look at exactly what's going on, what's being said in those things, you find that they're all about struggle and difficulty. They're not about simplicity and pleasure. All of you remember, I'm sure, that at the beginning of Twelfth Night, the lines actually run, "If music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it. Give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die." Exactly not about the music and love being, food and music being equivalent, but exactly about how there's this strange dietary thing that the more we eat, the less we need, the less we desire. Or that simple thing, the world's your oyster, comes from Shakespeare, right? We all use it all the time. What do we mean by it? We mean that pleasure is immediately available. We're in a state of lusty certainty, and everything we see is open to us, the way an oyster's open. But again, I'm sure some of you will remember, most of you will. What actually happens when that's said? Falstaff says, "I will not lend thee a penny." And Pistol says, "Why then, the world's mine oyster, which I with sword will open." And Falstaff replies to Pistol, "Not a penny, not a penny." It's exactly not about the world being your oyster in the sense of something that's just there for you to take. It's exactly about Pistol's determination to win his pleasures despite the enormous difficulty. And Shakespeare defines that difficulty for Pistol in tangible terms, in terms of the hardest thing you can think of is opening an oyster. What can possibly be harder than forcing an oyster open? And Pistol will do it with his sword. So exactly where we register in our kind of conventional understanding of Shakespeare, we register simple images of pleasure. What we actually find are complicated dialogues about difficulty. I think that's always true in the way that Shakespeare uses food, talks about feasts, and so on. There's an edge of discomfort, even sometimes of what we would now call the judgmental, in the way that Shakespeare uses and illuminates food. Even, you might recall, the Witches, to take the absolute extreme of this, the Witches' complicated recipe in the beginning of Macbeth with the liver of blaspheming Jew, which you recall goes into the pot. Now that seems to us grand guignol, something taken out to the absolute extreme, Shakespeare having fun with what's the weirdest thing you could possibly put in the pot. But remember, this is exactly the time when a Jew, when Dr. Lopez, the Queen's physician, has been drawn and eviscerated in public for false suspicions, and Shakespeare very likely is present at that. So the image of the liver of the blaspheming Jew, so far from being a grand guignol prop out someplace in a bloody prop room, is exactly something, the most terrifying image you could possibly draw from public experience. Again and again in Shakespeare, when images of food and diet come up, they go exactly to those extremes of difficulty, even of pain, not to the simplicities of pleasure. There's a wonderful book, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in the subject of Shakespearean food, called Food in Shakespeare, Early Modern Dietaries and the Plays, by a fine scholar named Joan Fitzpatrick. And what Fitzpatrick did was to look at what are called dietaries, that is, the whole literature of food and the morality of food that was around in the 1580s, particularly, when Shakespeare was, so to speak, coming of age as a writer and as a thinker. And what you find out is that all of these dietaries are heavily moralizing books. They're not books about the pleasures of the table. They're all books about the perils of gluttony. They're all books that point out how dangerous it is to overindulge in food and drink. There's a wonderful one by a writer named George Gascoigne that appears in the late 1570s, and the book is called A Delicate Diet for Dainty-Mouthed Drunkards. And in this terrific book, he talks about how gluttony and drunkenness, and I quote here, "harden the heart, blindeth the eyes, dulleth the wit, discourage virtuous exercise, hasteneth crooked age, make all lovely seem loathsome, defileth the body, and woundeth the soul." And one of the fascinating things is to see exactly how that kind of language, that hyperbolic language of accusation, gets carried over into the plays. The idea that overindulgence was sin, gluttony, very, very powerful at the time. There's a wonderful quotation even from Giordano Bruno, you know, the great scientist who was killed by the Inquisition later when he foolishly went back to England, from England to Italy, and was killed. While he was in England, he was stunned by the overeating. He couldn't get over it. And he wrote home at that time, no one is so well-mannered, tasting the drink that would be going around an Elizabethan table, as to omit leaving you some favor of the relics stuck to his mustache. If one does not want to drink among the English, either because he has not the stomach or because he considers himself above it, he need merely touch the cup to his mouth, so that he too can imprint on it the morsels of the saliva from his lips. Bruno is, as a contemporary of Castiglione and of Montaigne, is offended by the overcharge, the overeating that he finds going on in England, in Britain, all the time. And it's interesting to think about that because our ideal image that Eleanor mentioned before, that I talk about the kind of obvious, complex, philosophical pleasures of the table, that eating is primarily a good thing, a positive thing, a communal thing, that's really a much later development in Western thinking. It comes not from the time of famine and fear that Shakespeare knew as a young man. It comes from a time of abundance, which only appears in Europe much later on. That leads us, of course, thinking about gluttony and pleasure, heroism and overindulgence, above all to the greatest figure in Shakespeare who's involved with food, who's defined by his appetite, and that, of course, is Falstaff, the Falstaff of the two Henry IV plays and of the Merry Wives of Windsor. And what's fascinating, if you see Falstaff in the context of the way Shakespeare loves to talk about food, in the context of the dietaries, the food literature of his time, is exactly that everyone is always talking about Falstaff exactly in the language of those accusatory dietaries, of those accusatory books about the fears and the dangers of overindulgence, but they do it in an affectionate and bantering way rather than immediately in a directly accusatory way. Remember that Howe, when he's close to Falstaff, is unsparing in his mockery of his appetite in a way that rises from the kind of literature that George Gascoigne wrote. "You're a Titan kissing a dish of butter," Hal says to Falstaff, "an old fat man, a ton of man, a bolting hutch of beastliness, that huge bombard of sack, that stuffed cloak bag of guts, that swollen parcel of dropsies." Do you see how the teasing language that Falstaff uses comes right out of that kind of moralizing literature? With that love of horrified enumeration of all of the qualities that Falstaff has. And then that wonderful one of the most beautiful images of food in Shakespeare. He, Falstaff, Hal says, sweats to death and lards the lean earth as he walks along. A fabulous image, right? He's wrapped in bacon, right, like a lean roast. And as the bacon melts, it makes the roast tender, and he does the same thing to the earth from the sheer fatness that he carries around in life. It's a wonderful image, and it's hard at that moment, an affectionate image, but it comes out of this kind of literature against gluttony and overindulgence. Now, there's a fascinating digression, and I hope you'll forgive me if I just take it for a moment here. We all think of Falstaff as an anti-puritanical figure, as someone who represents the spirit of material indulgence against the puritanical spirit of asceticism. An understandable way to see him. And there are even some contemporary scholars, as I'm sure many of you know, who see Falstaff as a kind of what they call a crypto-Catholic figure. Because, as I'm sure many of you are aware, one of the new veins in modern scholarship is to see Shakespeare and the Shakespeare family as crypto-Roman Catholics, disguised Roman Catholics. And Falstaff, therefore, is a kind of figure whose Shakespeare is using against the Puritans. Here's a man who represents appetite, fleshiness, the carnal, the material, against the ascetic people of the world. That's a natural way to see him. But there's a fascinating argument by a wonderful scholar, a good friend of mine named David Caston, who's at Yale, and I urge you all to bring up here sometime to listen to. And what he says is a little more complicated than that. He says, and it's a slightly Baroque argument, but it makes a lot of sense. He says that what Falstaff really represents are the excesses and hypocrisies of Puritanism. Because as some of you probably know, the original figure of Falstaff, when Shakespeare first wrote the Henry plays, was called Oldcastle, Sir John Oldcastle. And John Oldcastle, we know that from many sources, and John Oldcastle was one of the leading Protestant martyrs of the real time, of the moment of Henry V. And his heirs, his legatees, were incredibly offended to find him being caricatured as this fat, sweating knight, and they made Shakespeare rewrite it and give the character a new name. But the question that always strikes everyone is, why would Shakespeare in the first place have taken this great Protestant martyr and turned him into this figure of gargantuan fun? And the argument is that though he was a Protestant martyr, he was an extreme Protestant. He was a kind of predecessor of the Puritans, who Henry V in history, historically, had rejected. And that what Shakespeare is really mocking in the figure of Falstaff, what he's having fun with, what he's satirizing, is extreme puritanical hypocrisy. That is, that Puritans pretend to be figures of asceticism, but they're really all secret fat men inside, like Falstaff. And if you think about it, it's a strange thought, but if you think about it, it makes good sense. You know what's the exact contemporary parallel of that? How do we make fun of communists, or how did we make fun of communists in the 20th century? Think of Ninotchka, Ernst Lubsch's great movie. Everyone know Ninotchka? Right? What happens in Ninotchka? It's not that the communists are represented as gaunt figures of puritanical rectitude. It's they all are filled with secret appetite. That's how you mock a communist. You say you pretend to be full of integrity. Actually, you're driven forward by appetite. And David Caston's argument is that's how we should understand Falstaff. Forgive the digression, but it shows again, I think, how complicated and double Shakespeare's attitude is at every time about appetite and the ambivalences of appetite. Yet Shakespeare exactly never neatly moralizes about food or about people who eat. Falstaff is a gargantua. He's a principle of disorder. He is a glutton, and he is certainly a drunk, but he is also heroic in his way. A drunk and a lecher and a glutton, lovable and dear, but extremely dangerous if he's left near power. I say no more. Harry outgrows him, and we tend to resent that moment in Henry IV, Part 2, where Hal dismisses Falstaff. But from Shakespeare's point of view, it's a serious dismissal. He's saying that, of course, we love Falstaff for his appetite, for his overindulgence, even for his gluttony, but he's not a safe counselor for a king. And when we play that today on the stage, we tend to make the viewer hate Hal and love the pathos of Falstaff. If you ever see Orson Welles' great Falstaff film, Chimes at Midnight, that's exactly how it's played. Hal is a prick, and Falstaff is Orson Welles, and how can you not love him? But when Shakespeare is writing it in the context of his time and his understanding of the meanings of appetite, he's saying something serious. He says, yes, I love Falstaff too, but I would never let him anywhere near the palace. It's dangerous when people like that are allowed near to power. It's exactly that kind of ambivalence, that perfect ambiguity, that I think makes Shakespeare the most interesting of all moralists. He is the one writer we have who is always capable of seeing both sides of a question without ever being wishy-washy. In fact, if I were asked to define Shakespeare's essential belief, the thing that moved him most in life, the message of his plays, it's that one should evade making moral choices as long as is humanly possible. He lived, after all, a life of that kind of evasion. Neither Catholic nor Protestant, at times pro-Elizabeth, but flirting with Southampton and Essex, switching to Scottish witches when a Scots king arrived. His morality is always finally evasive, trying to avoid too neat or too firm a position on anything. Avoid making dramatic decisions is exactly what the greatest of dramatists always insists. Don't divide your kingdom precipitously. Don't listen to witches. Use common sense. Use common sense when you are suspicious about your high-born Venetian wife. Hamlet can't make up his mind because he knows that if he puts off acting, he knows not because he's unable to make up his mind, but because he knows what will happen if he ever does make up his mind, and that it will be a bloody mess, which is exactly what does happen when he finally makes up his mind. And that's exactly, I think, why Shakespeare speaks to us when we deal with questions of table and questions of taste. Because finally, the morality of the table, the morality of those rituals of eating I was talking about at the beginning, are exactly ones of evasion in a sense. They're ways of finding ways that can put unlike people at a common table without beginning a civil war. You know, if I have one thought about what divides us as modern Shakespeareans, 21st century lovers of Shakespeare, from all previous centuries and generations of lovers of Shakespeare, it's that we tend to have a bit of an allergy to what we might call the wisdom literature in Shakespeare. I mean by that all of those famous soliloquies where some stuffy old white guy gets up and tells you how to live. Polonius is the most famous of all, of course, his speech, "Thine own self be true." For centuries, that was taken as incredibly good advice to give a young man, neither a borrower nor a lender be. You all know it, right? And now we're unable to dramatize that without making you dislike Polonius for doing it. I was just in London last week, and I saw Nicholas Heitner's wonderful new production of Othello, one of the great Othellos, maybe the best Othello I've ever seen. But I was also reading, and Nick Heitner was talking about how when he was working on a Hamlet, and that speech of Polonius's, the "To thine own self be true" speech comes up, he says the only way you can play it is if Polonius is confessing his guilt in the murder of the king, that he was participant in the murder of the king. Now, that may be the way it works dramatically, but I don't think that's the way Shakespeare intended it. I think Shakespeare loves figures of excess and indulgence, but he also really believes in the wisdom of temperance, the wisdom of the middle way. After all, what's the greatest speech on appetite in the entire canon of the plays? I think it has to be not any of Falstaff's speeches, it's Ulysses' speech in Troilus and Cressida about the virtue of degree and temperance in life, which turns exactly on a metaphor of what happens when appetite is fully unleashed. Remember, Ulysses says, if our appetites are completely unconstrained, if we get to do anything we like in life, why then force should be right, or rather right and wrong, between whose endless jar justice resides, should lose their names, and so should justice too. Then everything include itself in power. Power into will, will into appetite, and appetite, a universal wolf must make perforce a universal prey, and last eat up himself. All the images of appetite in Shakespeare, that may be the most powerful one. If appetite is left unleashed, justice, duty, reciprocity are all lost. And I think that we find that idea throughout Shakespeare. Not just a simple celebration of appetite, but a constant inspection of the ambivalences of appetite. Shakespeare tells us always, I think, that between pleasure and Puritanism, we should choose pleasure. But between pleasure and wisdom, we should choose wisdom. Well, I hope I've not left you with too dark a view as we continue on our own feast. And obviously there was a little head fake involved in my talk tonight, because I left out the most famous of all the Shakespearean aphorisms on food and eating at all. I'm sure it's been ringing through many of your minds and ears. It's the one from Twelfth Night, where Sir Toby Belch says to Malvolio, the Puritan, "Art any more than a steward? Dost thou think because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale?" And Feste says, "Yes, by St. Anne." The fool says, "Yes, by St. Anne, and ginger shall be hot in the mouth too." And Malvolio says, "Mistress Mary, if you prized my lady's favor at anything more than contempt, you would not give means for this uncivil rule." So even at that moment of the greatest repudiation of the Puritan denial of pleasure, even at the moment when Sir Toby speaks for all of us in saying to the Puritan, just because you're virtuous doesn't mean we can't enjoy our dinner. Just because you're good doesn't mean that cake and ale is banished from life. Shakespeare darkens it. Shakespeare complicates it a bit. He says, we should not give means for this uncivil rule. An uncivil rule for Shakespeare doesn't just mean impoliteness. He means that threatening maw of chaos that Ulysses references in his great speech on appetite. Malvolio, yes, Malvolio is a foolish killjoy in Twelfth Night, but uncivil rule is a real danger to Shakespeare, and it is produced by unimpeded appetite. Between pleasure and wisdom, Shakespeare tells us, choose wisdom. But where does wisdom reside? Where can it be found? Well, for Shakespeare, that truth, wisdom, can never be neatly articulated in philosophy, can never be cataloged in a dietary. It can only, and endlessly, be dramatized on a stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You were brilliant at the Shakespeare Slam, and you were every bit more brilliant tonight, so thank you.